What would you do if the person you spent 9 years trying to forget was standing 3 feet away from you, arranging flowers for your sister's wedding? Adrian Vale walked into that shop expecting white roses and baby's breath. What he found instead unraveled every lie he'd built his life around, because standing behind the counter, with rain streaking the windows and soft yellow light catching the curve of her jaw, was Alara Whitmore. And beside her, a little girl with his eyes, his hands, and a scar on her palm he'd never seen before. If you've ever lost someone and then had to face them again, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Hit like. And drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And Part 1. The rain started around noon and hadn't quit since. Adrian Vale sat in the back of a black SUV, his jacket still carrying the cold of the parking structure, watching the city blur past the tinted windows. His driver said nothing. His assistant had stopped talking 20 minutes ago when Adrian waved him off mid-sentence. Outside, the streets of Caldwell looked like every other November afternoon. Gray, slick, indifferent to the people hurrying underneath awnings and ducking into doorways with their collars up. He had 3 meetings before dinner. A call with the Western Investment Group at 2. And sometime between now and the rehearsal dinner tomorrow evening, he was supposed to stop at a florist on Mercer Street to confirm the arrangements for Sophie's wedding. Sophie had specifically asked him to handle it personally. She'd pressed the address into his hand last week, folded on a piece of cream note card paper. Please, Adrian, just go in yourself. Tell them it's for the Vale wedding. They'll know what to do. He hadn't thought anything of it. Sophie loved flowers. She'd been planning this wedding for 14 months and had opinions about centerpiece height and the difference between ivory and warm white that Adrian could not begin to care about. He figured he'd walk in, say the name, sign whatever needed signing, and be gone in under 7 minutes. That was what he'd planned. The SUV stopped at a red light on the corner of Mercer and 4th, and Adrian looked out at the narrow shop front tucked between a dry cleaner and a wine bar. A hand-lettered sign above the door read, Whitmore Floral, in dark green paint, letters slightly uneven, like they'd been done by someone who wasn't trying to impress anyone. A small bell hung above the door. A bucket of sunflowers sat on the step outside, unfazed by the weather. He told the driver to wait. The bell above the door made a thin, clean sound when he pushed it open, and the smell hit him first, green and damp and alive, layered over something sweet he couldn't name. Bundles of eucalyptus hung from a ceiling rack. White roses sat in low-glass vases along the left wall. Moss, wire, and ribbon occupied the long wooden work table in the center of the room. The shop was small and orderly in a way that felt earned rather than designed. Adrian stepped inside and let the door close behind him. No one at the counter. He heard movement in the back. The scrape of a stool, the brief sound of scissors, a soft voice saying something to someone he couldn't see. He stood near the entrance and looked around the space with the particular stillness of a man accustomed to reading rooms before he entered them fully. Old habit. The kind that stayed in your body long after you thought you'd changed. Then she came through the curtain. She was carrying a bucket of pale pink ranunculus in both hands, and she was looking down at them, checking for damage, and she didn't see him immediately. She wore a dark green apron over a loose white shirt, her hair pulled back in a way that had clearly started neat and come undone over the course of the morning. There was a small smear of something on the side of her wrist. Her hands were careful with the flowers. Practiced. She looked up. The bucket stopped moving. Adrian didn't breathe. He knew her face the way he knew the sound of his own name, involuntarily, below the level of thought, the kind of recognition that happens in the body before the mind can intercept it. 9 years. He'd spent 9 years building walls around the specific shape of that face, and now it was here, 3 feet away, looking back at him with an expression that was not quite shock and not quite fear, but something that moved between the two faster than he could track. Alara, he said. Her name came out quieter than he intended. Not soft. He wasn't soft, had spent the better part of a decade making sure of that, but low, stripped of everything except the fact of her. She set the bucket on the counter without looking away from him. Adrian, her voice was flat, controlled in a way that told him the control was costing her something. You need to leave. I'm here for the Vale wedding order. Sophie, I know who the order is for. She moved behind the counter, putting wood and glass between them like it would help. Her jaw was tight. I didn't know you'd be the one coming in. She asked me to handle it. Then you've handled it. The order's confirmed. Full install Friday morning, ceremony space and reception hall, both. You can go. He didn't go. He stood in the middle of the shop and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the rain tapped against the front window, and everything else in the room seemed to understand that it was not allowed to move. You've been in Caldwell, he said. It wasn't a question. He was still processing it. The fact of her, the shop, the years it must have taken to build this place. This whole time. That's not your business. How long? Adrian, how long have you been here? She pressed her palms flat on the counter surface. The small smear on her wrist caught the light. 6 years. Now please. A sound came from the back of the shop. Small feet. The particular weight of a child moving through a space they know well. No hesitation, no looking down. A little girl pushed through the curtain behind the counter, carrying a fistful of stems she'd clearly clipped herself, because the cuts were rough and the lengths were wrong. She was maybe 7. Dark hair pulled up in a lopsided bun that looked like she'd done it herself too. She wore paint-stained jeans and a gray sweater with a small hole near the collar. She looked at Adrian with total calm and total curiosity, the way children look at strangers when they haven't yet learned to hide their interest. Mom, she said, holding up the stems, I tried to cut the bottoms like you showed me, but I think I cut them wrong. Put them in water, baby. I'll fix them in a minute. The girl glanced at Adrian again. He hadn't moved. He couldn't. There was something happening in his chest that he didn't have a name for. Some catastrophic, quiet collapse behind his sternum that he had to work very hard not to let reach his face. He looked at the girl, dark hair, strong jaw, and her eyes. They were his. Not similar, not a resemblance. His. He looked at the scar on her right hand, a thin, pale line across the palm, old and healed over. He had one in almost the exact same place from a piece of broken glass when he was 9. The girl tilted her head. Are you here about the wedding flowers? He couldn't answer. His throat had closed. Lila. Alara's voice was careful, precisely careful, in a way that told him she'd been dreading something like this for a very long time. Go put the stems in the blue bucket in the back, and stay back there for a bit, okay? Lila looked between them. With the particular intelligence of a child who understands more than the adults want her to, and then she disappeared behind the curtain without argument. Silence. Alara was looking at him now with something that had moved past control into something harder, braced. Adrian turned his eyes to her slowly. How old is she? He said. Don't. Alara, how old is she? She held his gaze without flinching. She'd always been able to do that. It had been one of the things he... 7, she said. She'd just turned 7 in September. He did the math without wanting to. He'd never wanted to be good at math. He was very good at it. She's mine, he said. It wasn't a question either. Alara didn't try to pretend it was. Yes. One word. 7 years of silence, compressed into one syllable, delivered across a counter covered in green wire and ribbon, in a flower shop on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Adrian turned away from her and pressed the back of his hand to his mouth, and looked at the wall of white roses and breathed. He had controlled rooms full of dangerous men. He had sat across negotiating tables from people who'd have killed him for the right price, and held his posture and his tone without cracking. He had buried his father, buried 2 associates, buried the version of himself that felt things without calculating the cost first. He had been very good at all of it. He couldn't do any of that right now. His hands weren't entirely steady. He noticed that and hated it. I want you to listen to me, Alara said, her voice lower now, the control slipping slightly around the edges. She doesn't know anything about you. She knows her father isn't in the picture. She doesn't know your name. She doesn't know you were pregnant. He turned back around. When you left, you were pregnant and you didn't tell me. I didn't. She stopped, started again. It wasn't that simple. It seems like it was exactly that simple. Don't do that. Her voice sharpened. Don't stand there and make it sound like a simple equation. You are not a safe person, Adrian. The world you were in was not a safe world. I was 24 years old and I was alone and I was terrified and I made a decision to protect my daughter from my daughter. My daughter. She leaned forward, both hands flat on the counter. Mine. I raised her. I built this. I kept her fed and healthy and loved, and I did all of that alone. And you don't get to walk in here after 9 years and correct my grammar. He said nothing. She was right. He knew she was right, and it didn't make the thing in his chest any smaller. I need you to leave, she said again, quieter. And I need you to let me finish Sophie's order and deliver it on Friday and let this be the end of it. I can't do that. Adrian, she's my daughter. His voice finally cracked, just barely, just at the edge of the word. He closed his mouth, steadied, opened it again. I'm not asking you to trust me right now. I'm not asking anything from you. I'm telling you that I can't walk out that door and pretend I didn't just see her. Alara looked at him for a long time. He could see her calculating, the way she always had, not with numbers, but with stakes, with risk, with the question of what this would cost and who would pay it. You need to leave today, she said finally. I need time. Okay. And you don't contact her. You don't contact me. Not until I decide what to do. Okay. I mean it, Adrian. I know you do. He looked toward the curtain. From somewhere beyond it, he could hear the small, tuneless sound of a child humming to herself, the sound of someone perfectly at home in a world they understood. He stood there an extra 3 seconds listening to it. Just 3. Then he turned and walked to the door. His hand was on the handle when Alara spoke again. She has your temper, she said. Her voice was very quiet. She argues about everything. She never backs down. He didn't turn around. She sounds exhausting. A beat. Barely a second. She is, Alara said. She's also the best person I know. Adrian pushed the door open and walked back into the rain. He sat in the back of the SUV for 4 minutes before he told the driver to move. His assistant asked about the 2 o'clock call. Adrian said to reschedule it. Then he said to reschedule everything for the rest of the day. He looked out the window at the city, gray and cold and indifferent, same as always, and tried to remember how to be the person he'd been 3 hours ago. He couldn't quite find him. The Vale estate sat on the eastern edge of Caldwell, behind 2 sets of iron gates and a long gravel drive lined with bare November trees. The main house was large and old and had the kind of formality that came from decades of people living in it, who cared very much about what things looked like from the outside. Adrian had grown up in it. He'd also spent a significant portion of his adult life trying to understand why it never felt like home. He went straight to the study when he got back, poured 2 fingers of whiskey he didn't drink, stood at the window. His reflection stared back at him from the dark glass. He had a daughter. He had a 7-year-old daughter named Lila who clipped flower stems wrong and wore paint-stained jeans and had his eyes and a scar on her palm that matched his own. And for 7 years she had existed in this city, in that shop, under that rain, in a world he knew nothing about. He thought about the years, all the specific weight of them, the early years when he'd still been looking for Alara, quietly, through channels she would never have known about. The middle years when he'd forced himself to stop. The later years when he'd convinced himself the looking had stopped because he was over it, rather than because he'd run out of places to look. He thought about what he'd been doing in September, when Lila turned 7. He'd been in a meeting. He'd been in 3 meetings. He'd been making decisions about money and territory and leverage. And 3 miles away, a little girl with his face had been blowing out candles. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass. Behind him, the door opened without a knock. Thought I heard you come in. Victor Vale was 61 years old and had the kind of physical presence that a certain type of man mistakes for authority. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, with white hair, and the kind of tan that comes from a lot of time on boats. He wore his suits the way the house wore its formality. Like a skin he'd had long enough to forget it wasn't his, he was Adrian's uncle. He was also the man who'd run the Vale operation for the 6 years between Adrian's father's death and the point when Adrian had been deemed old enough to take it over, and who, in Adrian's private estimation, had never fully relinquished the feeling that it still belonged to him. "Uncle Victor," Adrian said without moving from the window, "you look like hell." Victor crossed to the drink tray and poured himself something. "How'd the florist go?" Fine. Orders confirmed. Good. Sophie's been anxious about it. Victor looked at him in the reflection. Something happened? Long day. It's 2 in the afternoon. Adrian said nothing. Victor waited a moment, then lowered himself into the leather chair across from the desk with the ease of someone who'd sat in it 1,000 times, in a room that wasn't his. I need you sharp this week, Victor said. The Harmon situation. I know about the Harmon situation. Then you know it needs handling before the weekend. Harmon's people are… Victor. Adrian finally turned away from the window. I said, I know. Victor studied him. Whatever Victor was, he wasn't stupid. He had the intelligence of someone who'd spent 60 years watching people for weaknesses, the way other people watched for weather. All right, Victor said, not quite agreeing to drop it. We'll talk tomorrow. He stood, straightened his jacket, and moved toward the door with the particular unhurried pace of a man who's never been in a genuine hurry because he's always believed events will arrange themselves to suit him. The florist on Mercer, Adrian said. Victor stopped, one hand on the doorframe. Did you know? Adrian asked. A pause. Fractional. The kind that meant almost nothing or everything, depending on who you were watching. Know what? Victor said. Adrian looked at him. That she was back in Caldwell. Victor turned slightly. His expression was exactly right. Mild confusion, the beginnings of concern. Who are we talking about? Whitmore, Adrian said. Alara Whitmore. Victor let the name land. Let a moment pass. That was a long time ago, Adrian. Yes. And it ended badly. She made her choices. She did, Adrian said. I'm starting to wonder what made her make them. Victor's eyes didn't change. That was the thing about Victor. His eyes were always the same. I wouldn't dig around in old pain. It's not productive. No, Adrian said. I don't suppose it would be. After Victor left, Adrian stood alone in the study for a long time. The whiskey glass sat untouched on the window ledge. Outside, the rain had intensified, drumming against the gravel in the drive. He thought about what Victor had said the night Alara disappeared, 9 years ago. She's gone, Adrian. Left a note. I read it myself before I brought it to you. He thought about how certain Victor had been, how quickly it had all been settled, how clean it had all seemed, which should have troubled him, because nothing in his family was ever clean. He picked up his phone. He called Marcus, his head of security, who answered on the second ring and said nothing beyond the silence that meant he was listening. I need everything you can find on Whitmore Floral, Adrian said. The business, the registration, the lease, when it opened. Who signed what? Everything. He paused. And I need someone to pull the file on Alara Whitmore, where she went after she left Caldwell, where she was before she came back, everything from 9 years ago until now. Marcus said he'd have it by morning. Adrian hung up and looked at the window again. His reflection. The rain. He had a daughter. He had a daughter, and somewhere in the architecture of the past 9 years was a lie so carefully constructed that he'd lived inside it without ever seeing the walls. He could feel the shape of it now, the specific hollow feeling of a man who's just realized that the ground he's been standing on isn't ground at all. He didn't know yet whose hands had built it, but he was beginning to have a very clear suspicion. He went back to Mercer Street the next morning. He didn't call first. He knew she'd told him not to. He also knew that if she'd wanted to disappear again, she would have done it last night, would have packed whatever she could carry and left the shop and found another city and started over the way she'd already proven she could. The fact that she hadn't told him something, even if he couldn't be certain what. The sunflower bucket was back on the step. A light was on inside. He pushed through the door. The bell rang. Alara was at the work table with her back to him, wiring something together with the kind of focused attention that meant she'd heard him and wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of turning around immediately. I said I needed time, she said. I know. It's been 12 hours. I know. She set the wire down and turned. She looked like she hadn't slept. He probably looked the same. I'm not here to fight, he said. I just need to ask you something. One question, and then I'll go. She waited. "The night you left," he said. "Someone brought me a note, said it was from you. Said you'd made a decision and you weren't coming back." He watched her face. "Did you write a note?" She went very still. "Did you write anything?" he pressed. "Send anything? Make any kind of contact before you left?" "No." Her voice was barely above a flat tone. "I left because I was afraid. I didn't have time to write anything. I barely had time to—" She stopped. Her eyes changed. Something moved in them. Calculation, fear, and beneath both of those, the specific expression of a person who is retroactively understanding something that was always there but that they weren't looking at correctly. "Who brought you the note?" she asked. Adrian held her gaze. He watched her arrive at the same place he'd arrived at last night, standing alone in his father's study with an untouched glass of whiskey and 9 years of carefully constructed grief rearranging itself into something new and terrible. "Victor," she said. Not a question. "I don't have proof yet," he said. "But yes." Alara turned back to the work table. She pressed both palms flat against the surface and looked at the flowers in front of her. White roses, same as yesterday, bundles of them waiting to be arranged for a wedding she'd agreed to work a month before she had any idea whose wedding it was. "He told you I left," she said. "He told me you left. He said he'd read the note himself. He was very kind about it." Adrian paused. "Victor is always very kind about the things he does." She didn't respond for a long moment. "What do you want, Adrian?" "I don't know yet," he said. And he meant it. There was something almost frightening about not knowing, for a man who'd spent 9 years building his entire identity around the certainty of his own decisions. "But I want you to know that whatever happened 9 years ago, whatever was done, I didn't know. I need you to believe that, even if you don't believe anything else." She was quiet for so long, he thought she wasn't going to answer. "She asked about you," Alara said finally. Her voice had gone strange, careful in a different way. "Last night, she'd seen you in the shop and she asked who you were." His chest tightened. "What did you tell her?" "I told her you were a customer, a man who'd come about the wedding flowers." Alara finally looked at him over her shoulder. "She said you had a sad face." Adrian said nothing. "She notices things," Alara said. "She's 7, but she notices things. She has your perception." He paused. "And apparently my face." Alara turned back to the roses. Her hands moved back to the wire, more slowly this time. "Come back Friday," she said quietly. "After the delivery. Not before." "Friday," he said. "And you don't go near her without my knowledge." "I won't." He left again. Out into the cold. Back into the city. He was halfway to the car when his phone buzzed in his pocket. Marcus, with the first batch of files already pulled. Adrian stood on the wet sidewalk in the November cold and opened the first document. He read the first 3 lines. Then he stood very still for a moment, rain on his shoulders, Mercer Street traffic sliding past him without caring. The lease on Whitmore Floral had been opened 6 years ago. The registered address, the business license, the initial deposit, all of it had been routed through a holding company that Adrian had never heard of, but that, under 3 layers of paperwork, traced back to a financial account that was not Alara's. It was structured the exact same way Victor Vale structured everything he owned. Victor had known she was here. Victor had known where she was for 6 years, which meant Victor had known about Lila. Adrian lowered his phone, looked at the closed door of the flower shop, looked at the bucket of sunflowers on the step, still unbothered, still bright and impractical against the gray November street. He thought about Sophie's wedding Friday, thought about the flowers Alara would bring into that hall, flowers she'd made herself with those careful hands, the same hands that had spent 7 years building a life on a foundation she didn't know was being watched. He thought about what a man like Victor Vale would do with that kind of leverage, and then the cold got into him properly, not the weather cold, but the other kind, and he turned and walked to the car fast and pulled the door shut and sat in the dark of the back seat. He had 4 days before his sister's wedding, 4 days to understand exactly what Victor had built around them and why, and what he was planning to do with it. And somewhere in a small shop on Mercer Street, a little girl with paint-stained jeans and his eyes was cutting flower stems with scissors, too big for her hands, humming to herself, completely unaware that the world her mother had so carefully constructed around her was not nearly as safe as it looked. The files arrived at 4 in the morning. Adrian hadn't slept. He'd been sitting at the desk in his private study, not the one off the main hall that Victor used like it was his own, but the smaller one upstairs, the one with the locked drawer and the window that faced east. And he'd been reading since midnight, going through everything Marcus had pulled. Property records, business registrations, financial routing documents that looked like nothing until you understood how the Vale family structured its holdings, and then they looked like everything. By 4, he had enough to know he wasn't wrong. By 5, he had enough to know it was worse than he'd thought. Whitmore Floral had been set up through a shell company called Aldrin Property Holdings. Aldrin didn't appear anywhere in the Vale family's public records, but it appeared 3 times in the private ledger system that Adrian's father had kept before his death and that Adrian had inherited without fully auditing. The same company had been used twice before, once to house an asset Victor wanted kept quiet, once to create a financial arrangement that kept a particular person inside a particular city without that person understanding the mechanism that was keeping them there. Victor hadn't just known Alara was in Caldwell. He'd helped put her here. Adrian sat with that for a while. Outside the window, the city was still dark, still wet, the rain having dropped to a fine mist that blurred the streetlights into soft orange halos. He thought about the architecture of it, the patience. 6 years ago, after however many years Alara had spent somewhere else, Victor had arranged a lease for a small flower shop on Mercer Street, under terms good enough that a young woman trying to build something from scratch couldn't have refused. He'd made himself invisible in the paperwork. He'd put her exactly where he wanted her, close enough to monitor, contained within a city where Victor had eyes, dependent on an arrangement whose strings she couldn't see. Why? That was the question Adrian kept returning to. Not how. The how was Victor, and Victor had always known how. But why keep her here rather than keep her gone? Why arrange her return at all? He didn't have that answer yet. He knew enough about Victor to know that a man who did things this carefully didn't do them for one reason. There was always the visible reason, the reason that made sense on the surface, and then there was the actual reason underneath it, the one that served Victor's longer game. Adrian closed the files, locked the desk drawer, and went to find coffee. He called Marcus at 7 and told him to dig into Aldrin Property Holdings from the outside. Find any public trace of it, any connection that could be established without going through Vale accounts. He said to do it quietly and to tell no one, and Marcus said he understood without asking who the no one was aimed at, which meant Marcus had probably understood certain things about Victor Vale for longer than Adrian had. At 8:30, Sophie knocked on his bedroom door. She was 26 and looked younger, and had their mother's quality of seeming to exist slightly outside the heavier atmosphere that surrounded the rest of the family. She was holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing an old sweatshirt, and she looked at him with the particular expression she'd developed over years of being the only person in the Vale household who treated Adrian like a human being rather than a function. "You look terrible," she said, "so people keep telling me." She handed him one of the cups and sat on the edge of the window seat without being invited, which was also very Sophie. "Did something happen at the florist yesterday?" He looked at her over the rim of the cup. "Why?" "Because you canceled your afternoon. You didn't come to dinner, and Victor said you seemed distracted when he checked on you, which means you said something to him that made him nervous, because Victor doesn't notice distraction unless it's pointed at him." She looked at him steadily. "So, what happened?" He considered how much to tell her. Sophie was not naive. She'd grown up in the same house, under the same weight, and she had the intelligence to understand the family business, even if she'd been kept deliberately separate from it. But she was getting married in 4 days and she was 26, and whatever was building in the structure of the next few weeks was going to be difficult enough without loading it onto her before he understood the full shape of it. "I ran into someone I used to know," he said. It was true. Sophie's expression shifted. "At the florist." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment and he watched her work through it. The florist on Mercer, the distraction, the canceled afternoon, and he saw the moment she arrived somewhere she hadn't expected. "Alara Whitmore," she said. His grip on the cup tightened slightly. "Sophie. She's the florist, isn't she?" It wasn't quite a question. "I found her 6 months ago. I looked her up specifically because I remembered her from before. I remembered how things were when you were with her, and I wanted—" She stopped, set her cup down. "I wanted the flowers for the wedding to mean something beyond just flowers. I thought if she knew it was for our family, she might not take the order, but she did." She looked at him with something that wasn't quite apology. "I didn't know you'd go in person." The morning light was gray and flat through the window behind her. Adrian looked at his sister and felt something complicated move through him. Not anger, not quite. Something more like the sensation of understanding that other people had been carrying information about his own life for longer than he had. "What else did you find when you looked her up?" he asked. Sophie's hands folded in her lap. "She has a daughter." "I know." "She's about 7. "I know." Sophie looked at him and didn't ask the obvious question because she'd already done the math the same way he had, and her eyes had the answer in them without either of them having to say it. "Does Victor know?" she asked instead. Adrian said nothing. Sophie went very still. "Adrian, don't." "Does he know?" He set his own cup down on the nightstand. He was tired in a way that had moved below the physical into something that lived in the connective tissue. "I need you to do something for me," he said. "I need you to behave exactly normally for the next 4 days. Talk to Victor the way you always talk to Victor. Don't change anything." "What are you doing?" "I'm finding out how much he knows." "And then what?" "I don't know yet." Sophie stood up. She was small. She'd always been small, which had always been misleading, because there was nothing small about the way she thought. "The wedding's in 4 days," she said. "If something's about to fall apart, nothing's falling apart." "That's exactly what someone says when something's falling apart." He looked at her. "I promise you, your wedding happens." She held his gaze for a moment, measuring the promise the way she'd always measured everything he told her. Not with skepticism exactly, but with the precise calibration of a person who'd learned early that love and honesty don't always travel together. Then she picked up her coffee and left, and he listened to her footsteps go down the hall, and then he sat there in the gray morning light with his hands between his knees and the particular feeling of a man standing at the top of a slope, watching the ground below and already knowing he's going to have to go down. He drove to Mercer Street himself that afternoon. No driver. He sat in his own car across the street from the shop for 11 minutes before he went in, which was long enough to watch Lila come out the front door in a yellow rain jacket, climb into the back seat of a small blue car, and be driven away by a woman in her 50s who was presumably some version of childcare. Long enough to watch Alara stand in the doorway, watching the blue car go, her arms crossed over her chest. That particular posture that people develop when they've done something hard so many times it's become muscle memory. He waited another 2 minutes after the car was gone. Then he crossed the street and opened the door. Alara heard the bell and looked up from the work table, and her expression did the thing it had done yesterday. That quick sequence of recognition, bracing, and something underneath it that she controlled before it could surface into something readable. "She's not here," Alara said. "I saw." He didn't move far from the door. "I need to talk to you, not about Lila, about the shop." She set down the ribbon she was working with. "What about it?" "The lease," he said. "Aldrin Property Holdings. Do you know who that is?" The change in her face was subtle and immediate. The kind of change that only happens when a name lands on something already bruised. "Where did you hear that name?" "I ran the business registration. Aldrin is the lessor on your lease, which means they own this building, which means they set your rent and your terms." He paused. "Do you know who owns Aldrin?" She was very still. "No, I've never met anyone from the company. The lease was handled by a property management firm. The terms were good. Too good, honestly. But when you're trying to start something from nothing and someone offers you a good deal, you don't—" She stopped. Her jaw worked. "You don't look it in the mouth." "Aldrin is Victor's," Adrian said. 3 layers of shell companies, but it comes back to him. The silence in the shop was different from the silences they'd had yesterday. Those had been weighted with 9 years and emotion and the shock of the encounter. This one was colder, more focused. "He's been paying part of your rent," Adrian said, "which means he's known where you are, what you're doing, and he didn't finish it. He didn't need to." "And about Lila," Ilara said. Her voice was flat, completely flat, which he recognized as the sound she made when she was too angry to let any of it into her tone. "He's known about Lila." "Yes." She turned away from him. She walked to the far end of the work table and stood there with her back to him, and he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands were pressing flat against the table surface, and he waited. "Why?" she said. "Why would he, if he knew, why wouldn't he just—" "I don't know yet." He moved closer, not close enough to crowd her, just closer. "But I know Victor well enough to know that information isn't something he collects accidentally. He knew. He's been watching. Whatever reason he had for keeping you here and keeping it quiet, it was useful to him." She turned around. Her eyes were dry and furious. "I built this. 6 years I built this, and it was his. He made it his without telling me." "He made himself a point of control," Adrian said. "That's what he does. He doesn't threaten you directly. He builds a structure around you that he can tighten whenever he wants." "And the note," she said. 9 years ago, he brought you the note." "Yes." "Which didn't exist." "No." She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he could see her working through the architecture of the last 9 years. Her exit from Caldwell, the years she'd spent somewhere else, the moment she'd found the offer for the Mercer Street location and thought it was luck or timing or finally her life starting to turn over. Watching her see it clearly was one of the harder things he'd witnessed, and he'd witnessed a substantial number of hard things. "He separated us," she said, "and then he brought me back and kept me close." "Why?" "Leverage," Adrian said. "Over me, or over you, or both. He didn't know I'd ever tell you. He knew I might find out. Victor plans for the versions he doesn't want. He keeps you here where he can see you, where he can verify you're not making moves he didn't authorize. If you'd gone somewhere else, somewhere he couldn't monitor, I'd be unpredictable." She said it slowly, like she was reading something in a language she'd just learned. "He needed me somewhere predictable." "Yes." She let out a breath, not a sigh, more like a controlled release of pressure. She picked up the ribbon from the table and then set it back down again, because she had nothing to do with her hands and apparently couldn't decide whether to give them something. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to understand the full picture before I move on any of it, which means I need a few more days and I need Victor to believe nothing has changed." "The wedding," she said. "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "You want me to come in Friday with the flowers and behave like everything is normal, with Victor in that room? I'm not asking you to. If I don't show up, he'll know something's wrong." She said it like she was working through logistics, which Adrian thought was exactly what she was doing. Missing the install doesn't just break a contract, it signals. "That's correct?" She pressed her fingers against her eyes for a moment, then lowered her hands. "Fine. Friday. I'll be there. I need you to keep Lila away from the event." Her eyes sharpened immediately. She was never going to the event. "I know. I just needed to say it. You don't need to manage me. I'm not trying to." They looked at each other across the work table with its roses and wire and ribbon, and it wasn't the look they'd had yesterday, which had been the look of two people processing a collision. This one was different, steadier, and more unsettling for being steady. "We're not on the same side," she said. It wasn't hostile, it was just precise. "No," he said, "not yet." He left. Marcus met him at this parking structure on 5th at 6 o'clock, which was where they met when Adrian needed conversation that didn't happen inside a building that Victor had access to. Marcus was 53, former military, and had the particular quality of loyalty that comes from a man who's decided to give it rather than being born into it, which meant it cost something and was therefore worth considerably more. "The Harmon situation," Marcus said without preamble. "It's not what it looks like." Adrian had been expecting this. Tell me. Harmon's people aren't pushing for territory. They're responding to something. Someone's been running product through their distribution network without their knowledge, using their infrastructure to move things they didn't agree to move. They're angry, and they don't know who to point it at, so they're pointing at us. Adrian stood in the parking structure cold and looked at the concrete wall. Someone used their network and made it look like it came from Vale. That's what the pattern looks like, yeah. How long has this been running? 8 months, maybe. Before that, it's clean. 8 months. Adrian did the calendar in his head. 8 months ago, Victor had been particularly insistent on restructuring certain logistics contracts that Adrian had signed off on without fully examining the details, because he'd been managing 3 other situations simultaneously and had trusted the summary he'd been given. He hadn't been given the right summary. Who knew about the Harmon network routing? He asked. Marcus was quiet for exactly 1 second. Short list. Your father's people, mostly gone. A few of the current ops team. A pause. Victor. Of course, Adrian said. I don't have proof, Marcus said. I want to be clear. What I have is pattern, not documentation. The pattern's enough for now. Adrian turned away from the wall. The Harmon meeting, when's it scheduled? Victor set it for Thursday, day before the wedding. Move it. To when? Cancel it. I'll contact Harmon directly. Marcus raised his eyebrows, which was the equivalent of most people openly expressing alarm. Victor's gonna want to know. Tell him I want more preparation time. He'll accept it. Adrian moved toward the elevator. And Marcus, that short list of people who knew about the Harmon routing, can you get me documentation on every communication that went through those channels in the last 8 months? It'll take time. You have until Wednesday night. He went up to his car and drove home. He thought about leverage on the highway, the way the city lights smeared past in the wet. He thought about the structure Victor built, patient, invisible, extending in every direction. He thought about Alara's lease. He thought about the fake note 9 years ago. He thought about Lila clipping flower stems with scissors too big for her hands, humming to herself, perfectly at home. He thought about what a man who built those kinds of structures would do when he felt them being pulled at from underneath. Wednesday arrived sharp and cold, and so did the first direct move. Adrian was in a meeting with 2 of the company's legal advisors. A legitimate meeting about a legitimate property acquisition, the kind of clean business the Vale Company had been expanding into for the last 3 years, as Adrian's long-term plan to exit the older operations moved slowly forward. He was in the middle of a conversation about zoning variances when his phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize, the woman on Mercer Street. You should know she's had a visitor this morning, not a customer. He excused himself from the meeting. He called Marcus from the hallway. Someone's been to the shop, he said. Find out who. It took Marcus 40 minutes. Adrian spent them in the hallway and then in his car in the building's parking bay, not driving anywhere, just sitting with the engine off and his hands on the wheel. Marcus called back. One of Donner's people, he said. Donner was a name Adrian knew, an associate of Victor's from the older network, not someone Adrian had ever fully trusted, not someone Victor had ever fully disclosed. What did they want? Shop owner says a man came in asking about custom arrangements for a private event. Didn't give a name, didn't leave a card, paid cash for a small order he'll never pick up. Spent about 12 minutes in the shop. 12 minutes. Long enough to look around, long enough to see the back room, long enough to note the layout, the exits, whether a child was on the premises. Does she know what it was? Marcus asked. She might. Adrian's voice was even. She's perceptive. He ended the call and immediately called Alara. She answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice was clipped. I was going to call you. I know. A man came in this morning. He said he was looking for arrangements for a private event. A beat. He kept looking at the curtain to the back room. Lila wasn't there. She's at school. But he kept looking at it. I know who sent him. Silence. Then, Victor. Yes. Her breathing was audible for a moment, just slightly. He's checking, she said. He's verifying that I'm still here, that nothing's changed. Or he's mapping the location. Adrian kept his voice level with effort. I need you to send Lila somewhere else for the rest of the week. Not school. Somewhere Victor's people won't think to look. My friend Dara, she's got a house outside the city. Lila loves her. Her voice had gone to the clipped precision she used when she was managing fear by organizing. I can have her there tonight. Good. Do it today. Don't tell Lila anything that would upset her. Make it sound like a fun visit. I know how to talk to my daughter. I know you do. A pause. Why is he moving now? The wedding's Friday. Why is he... I don't know, Adrian said, but I think he found out I was looking. Another silence, heavier this time. Adrian, she said, whatever he's planning, I know. He's had 6 years to build this, she said, whatever it is. I know that too. He watched the parking bay wall. Gray concrete, exactly as indifferent as everything else. Ilara, I need you to trust me. Not fully, not yet, but enough. The pause before she answered was long enough to live in. Enough, she said finally. That's all I've got right now. He took it. But Thursday came in with cold, clear skies and the kind of light that made everything look cleaner than it was. Adrian had breakfast with Victor. Victor was in good spirits. The controlled good spirits of a man who believes things are moving the way he arranged them to move. He talked about the wedding, about Sophie, about the catering arrangements. He mentioned, in passing, that he'd heard back from the Harmon situation and that there might be a path to resolution soon, said with the light tone of someone delivering news they believe will land well. Good, Adrian said. I'll want to see the terms before anything's agreed. Of course, Victor buttered his toast. You look better. Yesterday you looked rough. I slept. Good. You need to be present for Sophie's day. She deserves that. Victor said it warmly and meant it in his way. And that was the complicated thing about Victor. He was capable of genuine feeling for some things and simultaneous absolute ruthlessness about others. And he'd long ago stopped seeing any contradiction between the two. Adrian drank his coffee and discussed the catering and let Victor believe the storm had passed. He drove to Marcus's apartment directly afterward. Marcus laid the communications records on the table. 3 months of routing data from the Harmon network, annotated in Marcus's careful handwriting, with specific transactions flagged in red. Victor signed off on these directly, Marcus said. His personal authorization code. The transactions moved through Harmon's infrastructure and were flagged in the system as intercompany transfers, which would have looked routine to anyone not looking at the destination accounts. Adrian looked at the pages. Where's the money going? Marcus pointed. The destination account traces were complex. 3 countries, 2 currency exchanges, but the final landing point was an account Adrian had seen before, in his father's private ledger marked with the initials V.E., and a notation he'd never bothered to decrypt because he'd believed it was legacy business long settled. It wasn't legacy. It was current. Victor had been systematically redirecting Vale operational funds through the Harmon network and taking the margin personally, while structuring the transactions to create the appearance that the Harmon organization was the source of the irregularity. If the situation escalated to a conflict, which it was well on its way to doing, the trail pointed at Harmon, not Victor. Victor had built a financial crime and built a scapegoat for it in the same construction. How long? Adrian asked. The records I can access go back 2 years. I think it's older. Okay. Adrian looked at the table. He felt very still. The kind of still that comes after a long time of motion when you've finally arrived somewhere and the arriving is not a relief. I need copies of everything, off-site. Nothing digital. Already done. And I need you to reach out to Harmon. He paused. Not through official channels, personally. Tell him I want a private conversation, just the 2 of us, no associates. Tell him I have information that changes the picture of what's been happening. Marcus looked at him carefully. Harmon won't trust that. He will when I show him the same records you just showed me. Adrian stood up from the table. Victor built a fire and pointed it at Harmon. I'm going to redirect it. He was almost to the door when Marcus said his name. He turned. Marcus had his phone out. His expression, which was not generally given to expression, had gone to something Adrian rarely saw on it. What? Adrian said. 10 minutes ago, Marcus said, someone pulled a missing persons report on a child in Caldwell. He looked up from the phone. 7-year-old female. Dark hair. The name on the report is Lila Whitmore. Everything in Adrian's body went cold. Who filed it? He asked. His voice came out strange, very quiet, very flat. Anonymous tip. Filed through the department's online system. Marcus set the phone down. But the address given for the child's last known location? The shop, Adrian said. Yes. Adrian was already moving toward the door. His car. He needed his car and his phone and 3 seconds to decide whether to call Ilara first or go directly to Adrian. Marcus's voice stopped him at the doorframe. The report was filed at 9:14 this morning. He turned back. Lila left for Dara's place last night, Marcus said, which means whoever filed the report doesn't know she's already gone, Adrian finished. The two of them looked at each other across the small apartment. He moved early, Marcus said. Yes. Adrian's hand was on the doorframe. His knuckles were tight. He found out I was looking, and he moved early. He breathed once, deliberately, which means the wedding tomorrow isn't just Sophie's wedding anymore. What do you want to do? Adrian looked at the table with its documents. At 9 years of careful, constructed silence, about to break open in every direction at once. At the specific weight of having spent his whole adult life inside a machine built by other people's designs, and knowing the machine was now turning toward the one thing he could not afford to lose. Call Sophie, he said. Tell her the wedding proceeds. Everything proceeds normally. He paused at the door, hand still on the frame. And tell her not to be alone with Victor tonight. He walked out into the cold, clear Thursday morning, and the thing in his chest was not fear exactly, though it was close. It was the particular sensation of a man who has finally understood the full scope of what he's standing in, and who knows that whatever comes next, there is no version of it that doesn't cost him something enormous. He just didn't know yet whether what he was about to lose was everything he'd built, or the one thing that had mattered before he built any of it. He called Ilara before he reached his car. She answered on the first ring, which told him she'd been holding the phone. Lila's at Dara's, he said. Since last night. Why, someone filed a missing persons report on her this morning. Anonymous. Gave the shop address as her last known location. The silence on the other end lasted exactly 2 seconds. He counted them. They're trying to get police to the shop, Ilara said. Her voice had gone to that flat, organizing tone. Draw attention, create a record. Or flush her out. If Lila had still been there, the response would have brought her into a system Victor has contacts inside. He got into his car and pulled the door shut. She's safe where she is. Don't call her. Don't contact Dara through any number Victor could have access to. He doesn't have my contacts. He had your lease, Ilara. Assume he has more. Another silence. Shorter. Okay. I need you to open the shop today. Normal hours, normal behavior. If anyone comes in, you're a florist preparing for a wedding installation tomorrow. Nothing else. And tonight? Tonight you go home, you lock the door, and you don't open it for anyone who isn't me or Marcus. He paused. I'll send Marcus to your building at 6. He'll stay outside. You're frightening me, she said. Not as an accusation, just as a fact, delivered with the precision of someone who believed in naming things accurately. I know, he said. I'm sorry. He drove. The meeting with Harmon happened at noon in the back room of a restaurant in the warehouse district that smelled like old grease and cigarettes, and the specific variety of privacy that comes from a place where people have been having conversations they didn't want recorded for 30 years. Harmon was 60, heavyset, with the careful stillness of a man who'd survived long enough in a violent business to have learned that the men who moved fast were usually the ones who ended up dead. He looked at Adrian across a table with 2 untouched cups of coffee and said nothing for the first 20 seconds, just looked, taking the measure. You said you had something, Harmon said finally. Adrian put the documents on the table, copies of the routing records, the transaction flags, the authorization codes. He watched Harmon's eyes move across the first page, and then the second, and watched the stillness in Harmon's face shift into something colder and more concentrated. The expression of a man doing arithmetic that's coming out to a number he doesn't want. These authorization codes, Harmon said without looking up. Victor Vale. Personal. Running through my network. For approximately 2 years that I can document. Possibly longer. Harmon turned a page. His jaw was tight. He used my infrastructure to move his skimmed margin and built a paper trail that made it look like my people were the source of the irregularity. Yes. So if this had escalated to a full conflict between our organizations, the documentation would have pointed at Harmon. Victor would have been the aggrieved party coming in to resolve it. He'd have absorbed your operation under the justification of reparations, and there would have been enough legitimate-looking paperwork to make it defensible. Harmon set the pages down slowly. He looked at Adrian with the particular expression of a man recalibrating. "Why are you showing me this?" Harmon said. "Because I need an ally who has direct cause to want Victor Vale removed from a position of authority within my organization, and because I can't do it alone before tomorrow. Tomorrow. My sister's wedding. Victor will be present. It's the last controlled environment I'll have access to before he understands that I know what he's done and moves to a less predictable position." Adrian picked up his coffee cup, found it cold, set it down. After tomorrow, he'll have had time to cover the financial trail, and I'll have lost the documentation advantage. Harmon looked at the papers again. "What do you need from me?" "Presents. 3 of your people at the wedding venue tomorrow evening in a capacity that doesn't look operational. I'll handle the confrontation. I just need the room balanced." Harmon was quiet for a moment. "You're asking me to walk into a Vale family event. I'm asking you to walk into a room where the man who robbed you for 2 years will be standing with documentation in hand and watch me take him apart." Harmon looked at him for a long time. Then he picked up his cold coffee, drank it anyway, and set the cup down. "My people will be there," he said. Somewhat. Adrian was back at the estate by 3. He went to the main study, Victor's study, the one off the hall, and stood in the doorway and looked at the room with the particular attention he now understood he should have been applying for years. The desk, the bookshelves, the locked cabinet in the corner that he'd always assumed contained financial documents too old to be relevant. He crossed to the cabinet, tried the handle. Locked, predictably. He stood there for a moment, then went to the desk and went through the drawers methodically, not hurrying, not making noise. 3rd drawer. A small brass key on a ring with no other keys on it, kept separately from everything else, which was the tell of a thing you used regularly but didn't want associated with your other business. He took the key to the cabinet. The lock opened cleanly. Inside, 4 shelves. The top 2 held financial binders that were exactly what he'd expected. Old records, legacy accounts, the sediment of decades. The 3rd shelf held a row of unmarked folders. He pulled the first one. Photographs. Surveillance photographs printed on plain paper, dated in the lower right corner. The locations varied: a parking structure, a street corner, a school entrance. The subject of every photograph was the same: Ilara. He went through them slowly. The dates ran from 6 years ago to 3 weeks ago. Continuous, regular coverage. Not intensive, but consistent. Monthly, sometimes more. He recognized the angle of several shots. They'd been taken from across the street from the Mercer Street shop. Some showed the front of the building. Some showed Ilara coming out the door. Some showed her at the school entrance picking up a child. Lila in photographs going back 5 years. Lila at 4. Lila at 5. Lila at 6. Lila at 7, most recently, standing outside the flower shop in her yellow rain jacket with a backpack over one shoulder. Victor had a 5-year photographic record of his daughter. Adrian set the folder down on the desk. He stood there with his hands resting on either side of it, looking at the photographs, and he breathed through his nose and told himself to stay in the functional part of his brain, the part that planned and organized and moved, not the part that was currently sitting in the middle of his chest like a burning coal. He pulled the second folder, letters, handwritten. He recognized the stationery, thick cream paper, the specific weight of it, because it was the same stationery Sophie used for personal correspondence, ordered custom from a shop downtown. But the handwriting wasn't Sophie's, it was his mother's. His mother had been dead for 11 years. He turned the first letter over. Read it in under a minute. Then he sat down in Victor's chair because his legs had made a decision he hadn't consulted them about. The letter was dated 14 years ago, 2 years before his mother's death. It was addressed to Victor. It said, in his mother's precise and careful handwriting, that she understood Victor's concerns about Adrian's involvement with the Whitmore girl, and that she agreed the attachment had become a liability, but that she wanted to be clear she would not consent to any action that caused the girl direct harm. She would not consent to any action that caused the girl direct harm. He read that line 3 times. His mother had known. 14 years ago, while Adrian was 23 and in love with Alara Whitmore, and oblivious to any machinery operating around that love, his mother and his uncle had been writing letters to each other about it, about how to handle it, about whether Alara represented a liability to the family's interests. He pulled the next letter. It was Victor's response, in his uncle's architect's hand, measured, reasonable sounding, articulating the case for why the Whitmore girl's continued presence in Adrian's life presented a long-term problem for the Vale's succession. Using words like clarity of focus and appropriate alliances, and toward the end, a phrase that lodged in Adrian's sternum like something with an edge, the girl will be managed with appropriate discretion. He went through the rest of the folder. 4 more letters spanning the following year. His mother's position softening in increments, the way positions soften when someone with more patience than you keeps applying gentle, consistent pressure. Victor's language getting more specific. The final letter, dated 3 months before Alara had disappeared, his mother agreeing to something she'd written around obliquely, agreeing to remove herself from whatever discussion came next, to allow Victor to handle the situation in whatever manner he determined appropriate. She'd stepped back. She'd closed her eyes. She'd told herself it was necessary. And then she'd died, 18 months later, of a cardiac event at 62, and Adrian had spent 11 years missing her and attributing the hole she left to simple grief, rather than to the specific shape of what she'd actually been. He put the letters back in the folder. He put the folder back in the cabinet. He locked it with the small brass key and returned the key to the desk drawer where he'd found it. He did all of this with the careful precision of someone who needs their hands to be doing something functional while the rest of them processes an earthquake. Then he sat in Victor's chair for a while. He didn't look at anything in particular. He just sat with the specific quality of silence that settles over a person when they've discovered that the landscape of their own history is not the landscape they believed they were standing in. His mother had known. It didn't change Victor's responsibility. Victor had built the mechanism and executed it, but his mother had stood close enough to see it being built, and she had looked away, and the gap between those two facts was something he didn't have a category for yet. He got up, straightened the chair, walked out of the study. Buzz. At 5 o'clock, Sophie found him on the back terrace. He was standing at the railing with his jacket on, looking at the estate's rear garden. Brown grass, bare hedges, the particular austerity of a late autumn landscape that had stopped pretending to be anything comfortable. He heard her door open and her steps on the stone, and he didn't turn around. She came to stand beside him at the railing. They stood there for a moment in the cold without speaking, which was something they'd always been able to do. "You found something," Sophie said. "In Victor's study." "Yes." "Something bad." "Complicated." He paused. "And bad." She was quiet. A bird crossed the gray sky above the bare hedges and disappeared over the wall. "The wedding tomorrow," he said. "Adrian, it's going to proceed. I need it to proceed." He turned to look at her. "But some things are going to happen during the reception that you need to be prepared for." Sophie looked at him with the expression she'd had since childhood, when she was deciding whether to ask the full question or the partial one. She decided on the full one. "Is Victor going to be arrested?" He studied her face. "What do you know?" "I'm not stupid, and I'm not blind." She held his gaze. "I've watched him for 26 years. I know what he is. I also know what Dad was and what you are, and I've spent my entire adult life making peace with the fact that the people I love exist in a moral territory I don't fully want to map." She paused. "I'm asking because it's my wedding, and I'd like to know if something's going to explode in the middle of it." Not during the ceremony, he said. After. And Alara? He said nothing. She'll be there, Sophie said. With the flowers. She'll be in the room when it happens. She turned back to the garden. You should know, Adrian. I booked her on purpose. I know I told you I didn't realize you'd go in person, but that was only half true. I wanted her there. I thought if you saw her... She stopped. I didn't know about Lila. I didn't know what Victor had done. I just knew you'd been wrong for years, and I wanted to do something about it, and it was the most I could do from the position I was in. He looked at his sister. This small, certain person who'd grown up in the same house and breathed the same polluted air and somehow come out knowing exactly who she wanted to be. Thank you, he said. She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else. Don't thank me yet. Thank me when we get through tomorrow without the centerpieces getting knocked over. She went back inside. He stayed at the railing until the light was almost completely gone. At 7 that evening, everything changed. He was in his room, jacket off, papers spread across the bed, the copies of the financial records, the photographs in order, the reconstructed timeline of the last 9 years, when his phone rang. The number was Dara's. Alara had given it to him that afternoon as an emergency contact. He answered immediately. It was Dara. Her voice was controlled in the way that people control their voices when they are very frightened and very aware that they need to keep functioning. She's gone, Dara said. Lila, I put her to bed at 8 and I checked at 9 and she's... Her window was open. Her shoes are gone. I don't know how long... Adrian was already standing. Call the police. Should I... Call the police right now and stay in the house. Don't go outside. He was moving, jacket, keys, phone. Is there anyone outside? Any cars you don't recognize? I'm not sure. Go to the interior of the house. A room without windows. Lock the door. Call the police and do not open the door until they arrive. He was in the hallway, moving fast. Do you understand? Yes. I'll call you back in 10 minutes. He hung up and called Alara. She answered before the first ring completed. Something happened. Lila's gone from Dara's. Her window was open. He was on the stairs. Where are you? At home. Marcus is outside. Stay there. Don't move. I'm calling Marcus. Adrian. Her voice cracked on his name. Just barely. Just at the edge of it, the control breaking in the single syllable. She's 7 years old. She's 7. I know. He hit the bottom of the stairs. I'm going to find her. I swear to you, I'm going to find her. He called Marcus. 3 seconds. Marcus was already on. Lila Whitmore. She's gone from a house outside the city. He gave the address. Get there. Now. Take 2 people. He paused. And Marcus. If this is Victor, what? Adrian pushed through the front door into the cold night air. His car was at the bottom of the drive. If this is Victor, then someone told him where Dara's house was, he said, which means someone either followed Alara when she dropped Lila off, or someone had access to information I gave directly to 2 people. He stopped at the car. I gave that address to you and to Sophie. Marcus said nothing. I need you to think very carefully, Adrian said, about who might have had access to your phone in the last 24 hours. A silence that lasted 3 full seconds. My phone was at the estate this morning, Marcus said. His voice had changed, flattened into something that sounded like a man swallowing something terrible. I left it in the kitchen for 40 minutes while I was in the gym. I didn't think, okay. Adrian's hand was on the car door. Okay, go to Dara's. Go now. He got in the car and he drove. The city was dark and wet again, the rain having returned around sundown, and the streetlights made the road surface into a moving mirror. He drove without music, without the radio, with both hands on the wheel and his jaw tight, and every calculation he was capable of running simultaneously in the part of his mind that didn't have the option to panic. Victor had the address. Victor had moved faster than Adrian had expected, which meant Victor was more afraid than Adrian had estimated, which meant Victor had understood earlier than Adrian realized that things were coming apart. The missing persons report this morning had been a probe, a test to see whether Lila was at the shop, to identify her vulnerability. Victor hadn't expected her to already be moved. When the report came back negative, he'd broadened the search. Someone had followed Dara's car last night, or Marcus's phone had been accessed this morning, and Victor had redirected his resources to a location outside the city where a 7-year-old girl was sleeping behind a window that could be opened from the outside. He was 40 minutes from Dara's house. He made it in 28. The police were already there when he arrived. 2 cars, lights off as he'd requested when he'd called ahead, because the last thing he needed was the house visible from a distance. Dara was in the kitchen, a blanket around her shoulders, a police officer beside her. She looked at Adrian with the expression of someone waiting to be told that the thing they're afraid of is not true. He didn't have that to offer her. Marcus arrived 4 minutes after Adrian came through the door with 2 of his people and immediately went to the open window in Lila's room, a second-floor room, which meant someone had come up the exterior of the house, which meant it was planned, which meant the person who'd taken her hadn't come alone and hadn't come in a hurry. This was organized. A child doesn't wander from a second-floor room through a window in the dark. Someone had taken her. Adrian stood in the middle of Lila's room, a borrowed room, a guest room that Dara had tried to make welcoming with an extra blanket and a stuffed animal from a box in the closet. And he looked at the open window and the rain coming in and the small indentation in the pillow where a 7-year-old's head had been resting not 2 hours ago. He thought about the photographs in Victor's cabinet. Lila at 4. Lila at 5. 5 years of photographs of a child who didn't know she was being watched by a man who viewed her as a liability. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered it. "She's fine," Victor said. "I want you to know that. She's frightened, but she's physically fine." Adrian said nothing. He kept his voice locked somewhere it couldn't reach. "You've been digging," Victor said. "I expected a little of that. I didn't expect you to move as fast as you did. That's my mistake, and I'll own it." A pause. "But you need to understand the position you're in now. The wedding is tomorrow. Sophie deserves her day, and you are going to attend that wedding as the head of this family, and you are going to conclude your meeting with Harmon's people on terms that I set, and then we are going to have a very direct conversation about the limits of what you think you've found." "And Lila," Adrian said, "the child is not going to be harmed. I have never wanted to harm the child." Victor's voice was level, and infuriatingly Adrian believed the specific truth of that statement, which made it worse rather than better. A man who genuinely didn't want to hurt a 7-year-old but was holding her anyway because she was the most effective tool available. "She's a resource, Adrian, not a target. There's a distinction." "She is a 7-year-old child," Adrian said. His voice came out strange, very quiet, very empty. "She's leverage," Victor said, "and I'm sorry it came to this. I want you to know that I'm genuinely sorry. I made decisions years ago that I believed were right for this family, and I stand by those decisions. And I understand that you're angry. But this family has survived for 3 generations through clarity about what matters and what doesn't. And what matters is continuity. And right now, the greatest threat to that continuity is you making decisions with your heart rather than your head. Tell me where she is." "Tomorrow, Adrian. After the wedding. We'll meet, just the 2 of us. And I'll tell you everything. I'll explain the decisions I made, the reasons, all of it. And the child will be returned to her mother before the night is out." A pause. "But only if tomorrow goes the way it needs to go." The line went quiet. Adrian stood in the rain-wet room with the window open and the phone at his side, and he understood with absolute and terrible clarity that Victor had just told him the terms. Walk into that wedding tomorrow and perform the role of dutiful family heir, or a 7-year-old who had his eyes and his temper and couldn't cut flower stems correctly, stayed wherever Victor had put her. He also understood something Victor had not said aloud, but that lived in the architecture of everything Victor had done. If Adrian went to the police, if he tried to escalate through official channels, if he did anything that created public exposure for the Veil operation before Victor had time to manage the narrative, the financial records Adrian had would be neutralized by Victor's own documentation, a counter-narrative that had probably been in preparation since the moment Victor realized Adrian was looking. Victor had spent decades building this. Adrian had had 4 days. 4 days against 40 years. He turned away from the window. Marcus was in the doorway, watching him with the expression of a man waiting for orders, and already understanding that the orders were going to be harder than anything that had come before. "Get someone on Dara," Adrian said. "She stays safe." "And Alara?" Adrian thought about calling her, about the sound her voice had made when it broke on his name, just for a second, just at the edge of the control, about what it would mean to call her now and tell her that her daughter was taken, that the man behind it was untouchable until tomorrow, that the only path to getting Lila back ran directly through a wedding reception in a hall full of flowers Alara had made herself, and that he needed her to walk into that room and stand in that space and hold herself together for another 18 hours. "I'll tell her," he said. "Myself." He walked out of the room, down the stairs, out to his car. He sat in the driver's seat with the rain on the roof and called her. She answered before it rang. "Tell me," she said. Just those two words, low and flat and braced. He told her. The silence afterward was not like the other silences. It was not calculating or controlled or processing. It was the silence of a person who has just absorbed a blow to a place they can't defend, and who is sitting very still because moving might break something that can't be repaired. "Victor has her," Alara said finally. "Yes." "And his terms?" "The wedding proceeds normally. I attend. I perform. And after, he returns her." "You believe him?" It wasn't a question. It was the kind of statement that wants to be tested. "I believe he genuinely doesn't want to harm her," Adrian said. "I also believe he'll do whatever is necessary to protect what he's built, and that Lila being harmed would be a cost he'd pay if the alternative was losing everything." He paused. "So yes and no." Another silence, shorter. "What do you need me to do?" she said. He closed his eyes, opened them. The rain kept coming. "I need you to come to that wedding tomorrow," he said. "I need you to install those flowers and stay in that building and trust me to end this before the night is over." He heard her breathing, slow, deliberate, the way people breathe when they are making themselves. "If anything happens to her," Alara said, and the sentence didn't finish because what came after it was too large for language. "It won't," he said. "You can't promise that." "No," he admitted. "But I can tell you that the only person who's going to be walking out of that building without what they came for is Victor." A pause. "I'll be there at 8, she said. "For the setup." "Thank you." "Don't thank me." Her voice had gone back to flat, back to the tone that cost her something. "Just get my daughter back." The line closed. Adrian sat in the dark car with the rain on the roof, and he understood, with the specific bone-level understanding of a man who has just run out of the kind of options that allow him to remain the person he's been, that tomorrow was not going to be about strategy or documentation or the careful application of leverage. Tomorrow was going to require him to become something he'd spent 3 years actively trying not to be anymore. He started the car and drove back through the rain toward the city, and the man who arrived back at the Vale estate at midnight was not entirely the same man who had left it that morning, and the difference was not something that could be easily put back. He didn't sleep. He sat at the desk in the upstairs study from midnight until 4 in the morning, and he went through everything again. Not because he'd missed anything, but because going through it gave his hands something to do while the rest of him worked through what tomorrow required. The financial records, the photographs, the letters in his mother's handwriting. He sat with all of it spread across the desk under the single lamp, and he made decisions about the order of events and the specific moments in which each piece needed to move. And then he made contingency decisions for the versions where things went wrong, and then he made decisions for the versions where those contingencies failed. By 4, he had a plan that would work if 6 things happened in the right sequence. By 5, he had accepted that at least 2 of those 6 things were outside his control. By 6, he was in the shower with the water as hot as it would go, both hands flat against the tile wall, breathing through the steam, trying to clear out everything that wasn't useful and keep only what was. He thought about Lila in a room somewhere, frightened, waiting. 7 years old. He thought about the stuffed animal Dara had put in the guest room. He thought about paint-stained jeans and scissors too big for small hands, and the tuneless sound of a child humming to herself in a space she felt safe in. He turned the water off. He got dressed slowly and deliberately, the way he'd learned to get dressed before things that mattered. Dark suit, no tie until later, jacket last. He looked at himself in the mirror for a moment, not checking, just acknowledging. The face that had looked back at him from windows and glass surfaces for 32 years. The face that Lila had apparently looked at in a flower shop and recognized something in without knowing why. He went downstairs. Alara arrived at the venue at 8, as she'd said. Adrian watched from the mezzanine level as her van pulled into the service entrance. She got out alone, no assistants, no extra staff, and began unloading by herself, making trips with flower arrangements the size of small trees, moving with the particular efficiency of someone who has decided that motion is the only thing standing between them and coming apart. He went down to meet her. She looked at him when he appeared at the service entrance, and what crossed her face was not relief exactly. It was something harder and more complicated. The expression of a person who has spent the night in the worst kind of alone and is not yet willing to let it show fully. "Any contact?" he asked. "Nothing." She lifted another arrangement from the van. "You?" "No, Victor's letting it sit." He took the arrangement from her hands. She didn't argue. "That's deliberate. He wants us walking in there already worn down." "It's working," she said flatly. They worked together in silence for 20 minutes, carrying flowers into the reception hall through the service corridor. The hall itself was still empty at this hour. Round tables with white linens, chairs stacked at the perimeter, the ceremony arch at the far end waiting for its arrangement. In the early morning light coming through the high windows, the space had the particular quiet of a place that knew what was coming and wasn't ready yet. Alara worked with her hands and said almost nothing. He watched her from the corner of his eye. The set of her jaw, the way she handled each stem with automatic care even now, muscle memory overriding everything else. She'd built something real in that shop. He'd understood that intellectually. Watching her work, he understood it differently. "When this is over," he said. She glanced at him. "The lease, Aldrin, all of it. I'll restructure it to your name directly. The building, if you want it. Clean title." She was quiet for a moment, pressing stems into the arch foam. "That's not what I'm thinking about right now." "I know, I'm just—" He stopped. I needed to say something that was about after. She looked at him sideways. Something in her face shifted, very slightly, towards something that wasn't anger or fear, but that lived in the same neighborhood as both. "After," she said, like the word was a place she hadn't been sure existed until just now. They finished the installation by 10:30. He walked her to the mezzanine level, which had a clear sightline to every entrance of the hall below, and told her to stay there until he came for her or Marcus came for her, and under no circumstances to move toward Victor or any of Victor's people regardless of what she saw or heard. She looked at him with the expression of a person deciding whether to argue, and then she nodded once, and he understood that the nod was costing her more than most things cost most people. He left her there and went to find Victor. Victor was in the bridal suite on the second floor. Because of course Victor always occupied the highest status room available, moved through spaces as though they'd been arranged for his benefit. He was standing at the window in his morning suit, looking down at the venue gardens, and he turned when Adrian came in with the easy, relaxed motion of a man who slept well and expected today to go his way. "Good morning," Victor said. "You look like hell." "Where is she?" Adrian said. "Relax, she's fine." "Victor, where?" Victor straightened his cufflinks. "Somewhere safe and warm, with people who have instructions to treat her well. She'll be returned to her mother before 10 o'clock tonight, provided—" "Tonight." Adrian heard his own voice. Flat, definite. "I'm going to need better than tonight." "That's the arrangement?" "Change the arrangement. I want her back before the ceremony." Victor looked at him with the patient, faintly disappointed expression of a man dealing with a child who hasn't understood the rules. "That's not possible. I'm sure you understand why." "Because she's the only leverage you have. Because she's how I ensure this day goes smoothly." Victor moved away from the window toward the small table with its coffee service. He poured himself a cup with the unhurried ease of someone demonstrating that they have nowhere pressing to be. "I know you've been in my study, Adrian. I noticed the key was moved. I want you to know I'm not angry about it. Adrian said nothing. You found the letters, Victor said. Your mother's letters. I kept them because they're important context. What those letters show is that your mother understood ultimately what was necessary. She was a brilliant woman, stronger than your father in most of the ways that mattered. He drank his coffee. She made a hard decision because she loved this family. She made a coward's decision, Adrian said, because you wore her down until she did. Victor's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. A small, precise shift, like a door closing. That's a harsh reading of a woman who sacrificed a great deal for you. Don't talk to me about sacrifice. You separated me from my daughter before she was born. I protected this family. You protected yourself. You built a financial crime and pointed it at Harmon as a scapegoat. You've been pulling money out of Vale operations for years and constructing a narrative that would have started a war that cleaned up your mess. Adrian took 2 steps into the room. I have the documentation, all of it. Harmon has copies. Victor set the coffee cup down slowly. Harmon. We met Thursday. I showed him the routing records, the authorization codes, the destination accounts. Adrian watched his uncle's face. He was not, as you might imagine, pleased to discover that he'd been used as an unwitting vehicle for your personal enrichment. For the first time, something moved in Victor's expression that wasn't controlled. It was small and quickly managed, but it was there. The specific contraction of a man who has miscalculated and is processing the miscalculation without the luxury of time. That was reckless, Victor said. Going to Harmon was the only move that created a counterweight you couldn't neutralize. Adrian was close now, 6 feet, 5. You've spent 40 years building leverage. You're very good at it. But leverage only works when the other person doesn't know what you've built. Harmon knows. Marcus knows. And in about 45 minutes, the 2 attorneys I had on retainer last night are going to be walking into the offices of the Financial Crimes Division of the city's investigative authority with copies of every document I pulled from your private accounts. Victor looked at him. The room was very quiet. The little girl, Victor said. His voice had changed, quieter, more careful. You understand that if you do this, tell me where she is, Victor. Adrian, tell me where my daughter is. The name landed differently than anything else. My daughter. Victor heard it. Adrian could see him hearing it, could see the specific recalibration happening behind the controlled surface of his uncle's face. The recognition that the man standing in front of him was not the man he'd managed for 20 years, but someone who'd arrived somewhere new and wasn't coming back from it. If I tell you where the child is, Victor said carefully, I have nothing left. Yes, Adrian said. That's correct. Victor looked at him for a long moment. The morning light through the window fell across the space between them. Somewhere below, the venue staff were beginning to prepare the hall. The sound of it, distant, mundane, the ordinary business of a day being arranged for a wedding, made everything in this room feel stranger by contrast. You are going to destroy this family, Victor said. You destroyed it, Adrian said. I'm just the one who's going to admit it. Victor picked up his coffee cup again, looked at it, set it down. He turned to the window. He was quiet for long enough that Adrian started to calculate what came next if this didn't resolve in the next 2 minutes. Then Victor gave him an address, a property 30 minutes outside the city. A small residential building Victor owned through another shell company, not Aldrin, a different one, which meant there were more layers than Adrian had found. He pulled out his phone and texted the address to Marcus immediately, watching Victor's face while he did it. Victor watched him text and said nothing. Your people there, Adrian said. How many? 2. They're not armed. They have instructions not to harm her. Victor's voice had gone to something Adrian hadn't heard in it before. Not quite defeat. Victor would never be simple enough for that. But something in the vicinity of it. I want you to know that I never intended for it to go this far. I believe you, Adrian said. I also believe that intention stopped mattering some time ago. He moved toward the door. Adrian, Victor's voice stopped him at the threshold. He turned. Victor was still at the window. In the morning light, he looked older than he had an hour ago, which Adrian understood was not the light, but the particular effect of a man who's spent 40 years holding something together, watching it come apart. "Your father knew," Victor said. "About Ilara. About the decision. He didn't ask me to handle it. He just didn't tell me not to." Adrian held his gaze. "I know, and you can live with that. I don't have a choice about living with it. Neither do you." He paused at the door. "The wedding proceeds. For Sophie. After the ceremony, you will present yourself to the attorneys. I've arranged it so there's a process that doesn't require you to be publicly removed in front of the family." "How gracious," Victor said quietly. "It's not for you. It's for Sophie." He opened the door. "Stay away from Ilara today. Stay away from the hall until the ceremony. And Victor," he stopped in the doorway, "if Marcus gets to that property and Lila isn't there, every arrangement I just offered you disappears, all of it. Public, immediate, and loud." He walked out. Halt. His phone rang 7 minutes later. "Marcus." "We're at the property," Marcus said. "She's here. She's okay. She's—" A pause. The background noise shifted, and then, unmistakably, the sound of a child's voice, not crying, not the voice of a child who'd been crying, but the voice of a child who'd decided that crying wasn't worth it, and had moved on to demanding information about what was happening. "She's asking a lot of questions," Marcus said, with something in his voice Adrian hadn't heard there before. "That sounds right." His throat was tight. Tell her her mother's coming." Already on the phone with her mother, he stopped walking. He was in the corridor outside the bridal suite, alone, and he stood there with his hand on the wall and let himself feel it for exactly 10 seconds. The specific, enormous relief of it, flooding through him and then receding, because there was still a wedding to get through and still a full-scale implosion of everything he'd built his life around to manage. And 10 seconds was all he could afford. 10 seconds. Then he straightened his jacket, put his phone in his pocket, and walked toward the staircase. The ceremony was at 2. Sophie walked down the aisle in a dress that their mother would have loved, on the arm of an uncle from their father's side, who had nothing to do with any of this, and whose main quality was that he'd always been kind to Sophie and had continued to be long after it was professionally useful. Her husband-to-be, a quiet architect named James, who'd been good for Sophie in all the specific ways that Adrian couldn't articulate but could recognize, waited at the arch, surrounded by Ilara's white roses and green eucalyptus and whatever else she'd put together in that arrangement that made the whole thing smell like something alive. Adrian stood at the front beside James, best man, because Sophie had asked him 2 months ago and he'd said yes without hesitation. He stood there during the ceremony and he watched his sister's face and he let everything else sit in his peripheral vision. Victor in the 3rd row, contained, still, the face of a man who'd decided to play out the last act with whatever dignity remained available. And he didn't think about the attorneys or the documents or the phone call that was happening right now between Ilara and her daughter. He thought about Sophie. He thought about the fact that she'd booked Ilara deliberately 6 months ago with the careful covert hope of someone who loves her brother and has been watching him be wrong for years and can't say it directly, so she does what she can from the position she's in. He thought about the specific quiet heroism of that. He thought about how much he'd missed in the years he'd spent being exactly what Victor and his father and the whole structure of this family had required him to be, and how long it takes to understand that the cost of that kind of obedience isn't just what you give up, but what you become in the giving. Sophie said her vows in a clear, unwavering voice. James said his with his hand shaking slightly, which made Sophie smile. Adrian stood beside them and felt something in his chest that had been locked for a very long time move, slowly, toward something that might eventually become its opposite. The reception began at 4. At 4:15, Ilara came down from the mezzanine. She walked into the reception hall through the side entrance and stood near the wall of white roses she'd built. And she looked at the room, the people, the tables, the flowers, Victor in conversation with 2 men Adrian didn't recognize near the far exit. and her face was the face of a woman who has survived the worst night of her life and come out the other side still standing and is not yet sure how to feel about that. Adrian crossed the room to her. She looked at him when he reached her, and her eyes were dry and very clear, and she said, "She's okay. I know. Marcus is bringing her. She'll be here in 20 minutes." She pressed her lips together for a moment. She was angry, not scared, angry. She told Marcus she'd memorized the license plate of the car that brought her there. Something in Adrian's chest shifted. Of course she did. Alara made a sound that was close to a laugh. It didn't quite make it all the way there. "She has your temper," she said, like she had once before, but differently now. "I know," he said. They stood close together among the white roses and the reception noise, and he looked at her, and she looked back at him. And neither of them said anything for a moment because there wasn't a sentence that covered the full distance between where they'd started and where they were standing. "Victor's still in the room," she said. "He'll be leaving within the hour." He paused. "He gave me the address." He gave her up. It wasn't nothing. Alara looked at Victor across the crowded hall. He was standing with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching the room with the expression of a man making a last survey of something he's about to leave. As though he could feel her looking, he turned his head slightly in their direction. For a moment, the three of them were connected across the space of the room. The man who'd built the machinery, the woman who'd been run through it, and the distance between them that the machine had made. Then Victor turned away. Then Adrian's phone buzzed. Marcus, at the entrance. He looked at Alara. She was already moving toward the door. He followed her. They came out into the corridor at the same moment that Marcus appeared around the corner with Lila beside him. Lila in yesterday's clothes, with her hair coming out of its bun, and a look on her face that was exactly the combination of exhausted and furious, and trying very hard not to show the part underneath those things that had been afraid. Alara dropped to her knees in the corridor, and Lila walked into her like she was walking into a wall she'd been leaning toward for hours. And Alara's arms went around her daughter, and the sound she made was not something Adrian could describe, and he didn't try. He stood back, gave them the space. Lila had her face pressed against her mother's shoulder, and Alara had both arms around her, and the corridor was empty and quiet except for the distant sound of the reception happening behind closed doors. And Adrian stood 5 feet away and felt the specific weight of all the time he had not been here. Then Lila turned her head and looked at him from within the circle of her mother's arms. She studied him with the particular calm directness of a child who has decided that the current situation is unusual enough to require information gathering before response. "You were at the flower shop," she said. "Yes." "Mom said you were a customer." She frowned slightly. "But you don't look like a customer." He crouched down to her level. This brought him closer to her than he'd been in the shop. And at this distance, the resemblance was not something either of them could manage not to notice. He watched her notice it. "I'm not a customer," he said. "Then who are you?" He looked at Alara over Lila's head. Alara was watching him with the expression of a woman standing at the edge of something she can see clearly but hasn't stepped across yet. He looked back at Lila. "I'm someone your mom is going to explain to you," he said, "when she's ready. And when she does, I'll be wherever you want me to be." Lila considered this with the gravity of a child who takes information seriously. "That's a weird answer." "I know." "Are you going to be around?" He held her gaze, his daughter's gaze, the eyes he'd carried in his own face for 32 years, looking back at him from a 7-year-old face with paint probably still under her fingernails and a scar on her palm that matched his own. "Yes," he said, "I'm going to be around." Lila looked at him for another moment. Then she turned back into her mother's shoulder, apparently satisfied with this information for now, and no longer willing to spend energy on it, with the magnificent economy of a child who has had a long day and knows what's essential. Alara met his eyes above their daughter's head. He stood up, straightened his jacket. In the room behind them, the reception continued. Music and voices and the ordinary sound of people celebrating something. And in the corridor, the three of them existed in a pocket of quiet that felt like the specific silence before something begins rather than the silence after something ends. Then Marcus's radio crackled at the far end of the corridor, and Marcus's voice came down to them, low and sharp. "We have a problem." Adrian was already moving. "Victor?" Marcus said when Adrian reached him. "He didn't go to the attorney's. He's not in the building." Marcus turned the radio over in his hands. "His car's gone from the lot. And the two men he was talking to at the reception, nobody knows who they were." Adrian stood very still in the corridor and understood that he had underestimated Victor one final time. Victor hadn't surrendered. He'd made Adrian believe he had. And somewhere in the city, the man who'd spent 40 years building a structure designed to survive everything was making a move that Adrian hadn't seen coming, with assets Adrian hadn't known he had, toward an endpoint that was still, even now, not fully visible. And the wedding was still happening behind those doors, and Alara and Lila were 20 feet away in the corridor, and Adrian had exactly no margin left for being wrong about what came next. Adrian moved fast down the corridor to the venue's rear exit, phone already at his ear. Marcus followed 2 steps behind. "His car," Adrian said. "What time did it leave the lot?" "Security footage shows it pulling out at 4:03. 11 minutes into the reception." Marcus's voice was tight. He was already planning to leave before the ceremony ended. The whole conversation in the bridal suite. He was buying time. And the 2 men from the reception. "I'm running their faces through the venue's entrance footage now. It'll take 20 minutes. "I don't have 20 minutes. Adrian pushed through the exit door into the cold late afternoon air. The parking lot was half full, ordinary, indifferent. His breath made clouds in the November cold. "He's going to the financial records. If he can get to the source files before the attorneys do." "The attorneys filed at 2, Marcus said, "before the ceremony. You told me to move the filing up this morning." Adrian stopped. He stood in the parking lot cold and processed that. He had told Marcus to move the filing up. At 6 this morning, in the 20 minutes between the shower and getting dressed, when he'd run through the contingencies for every version where things went wrong, he'd added it as a quiet instruction at the end of a longer list of things, and then the morning had happened and Victor's terms and Lila's disappearance and the ceremony and everything else, and he'd forgotten telling Marcus to do it, forgotten it completely, because the mind under extreme pressure sheds things it doesn't have immediate use for. The attorneys had filed at 2 o'clock. Victor was running toward a door that was already closed. "He doesn't know," Adrian said. "Not unless someone told him." "Who would have told him?" Marcus was quiet for exactly 1 second. "No one I can identify." The attorneys were instructed to maintain silence until confirmed receipt. "Then he's running," Adrian said. "And he doesn't know yet that he's running toward nothing." He stood in the cold another moment, recalibrating. If Victor was heading to the source files, wherever he'd stored his own copies of the financial documentation, his counter-narrative, and if the filing was already in the hands of the investigative authority, then Victor's move was not a threat to the legal case. But that didn't mean it was harmless. A man running toward a locked door doesn't stop moving just because the door is locked. He tries other doors. Where else would he go, Adrian said. Not to Marcus, to himself. And then he knew. He drove alone. He told Marcus to stay at the venue with Alara and Lila, and he left before Marcus could argue, because this was not a situation that needed more people. More people meant more witnesses, meant more angles, meant more of a story that would be told in ways he couldn't control. Victor had gone to the estate. Adrian was certain of it the way he was certain of things he couldn't entirely explain. Not intuition exactly, but the specific knowledge that comes from spending your entire life inside the mind of someone else's construction, knowing the shape of it so well you can find the exits without being told where they are. The estate was where Victor kept everything that mattered. It was where he'd kept the photographs of Lila, the letters from Adrian's mother, 40 years of documentation about a family operation he'd run as though it were his own. The estate was where Victor would go to retrieve whatever he believed could still save him. He made the drive in 22 minutes. The gravel drive was dark. The estate staff left at 5 on Fridays, a long-standing arrangement that Victor himself had established years ago. And there was one light on in the main house, ground floor, the study. Victor's study. Adrian parked and walked to the front door and unlocked it with his own key. He went to the study. Victor was at the cabinet in the corner, the one with the brass key, now open, with folders pulled and spread across the desk. He was photographing pages with his phone when Adrian appeared in the doorway, and he turned at the sound of Adrian's step with the expression of a man who is not surprised, but who had calculated he had more time than he did. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Victor looked at him across the desk and the spread photographs and the letters in Adrian's mother's handwriting. He had taken off his wedding day jacket. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow. He looked like what he was, a 61-year-old man doing the hard physical work of trying to survive a collapse he'd seen coming from farther away than Adrian had given him credit for. "The attorneys filed at 2, Adrian said. Victor set his phone down. He looked at the pages. He looked at his phone. He looked at Adrian. "Before the ceremony," Victor said. "Yes." "You didn't tell me." "No." Victor sat down in the chair behind the desk. He sat heavily, the specific heaviness of a person whose body has just been informed of something the mind is still processing. He looked at the photographs of Lila arranged across the desk surface. 5 years of them, the evidence of a surveillance operation that had been running quietly alongside everything else. And he pressed his hand flat over them, not covering them exactly, just resting his palm there. "The counter-narrative," Adrian said. "Whatever you were building, it's too late." "I know." "Then why are you here?" Victor looked up. In the lamplight, his face had changed in the last 3 hours, in the way that faces change when they've been holding something in place for a very long time, and the thing has finally given way. He looked older, not weaker. There was nothing weak about Victor, even now, and Adrian had enough clarity about that to acknowledge it, but older. Arrived somewhere that had taken 61 years to reach. "I wanted to see it," Victor said. He gestured at the spread documents. "One more time. I wanted to see what I built." Adrian moved into the room. He didn't sit. He stood across the desk from his uncle in the lamplight and looked at the photographs and the letters and the financial documents, the physical record of decisions made over decades, the architecture of a life organized entirely around the principle that control was survival, and survival was the only value that couldn't be negotiated. "Why, Alara?" he said. "Specifically, there were other women I was involved with, other people who could have been categorized as liabilities. Why her?" Victor was quiet for a moment, a genuine moment, not a calculating one. "Because she was the only one you would have chosen over this." He gestured, a small gesture, taking in the room, the house, all of it. "The others, you cared about them in your way, but you would have eventually chosen this. The empire, the responsibility, the name. You would have eventually made the decision that was right for the family, the way your father did, the way I did." He paused. "With her, I wasn't certain, and I couldn't afford uncertainty." Adrian held his gaze. "And Lila? I didn't know about the child until she was already born. Alara was gone before I discovered it." Victor turned the photographs face down, slowly, one by one. "I made a decision. A child with your blood, outside the structure of this family, raised by a woman who had reason to expose what I'd done. That was a specific category of vulnerability. I needed to know where she was. I needed to know what she knew and what she might eventually say." He looked up. "So I brought them back, contained, visible. That was all." "That was all," Adrian repeated. "I told you, I never wanted to harm the child." "You used her as leverage last night." "Yes." Victor's voice didn't change. "When I had nothing else, I used what I had. That's not a defense. That's just what happened." He folded his hands on the desk. "I understand that there's no version of what comes next that includes me walking away from this. The filing, the Harmon situation, the records you pulled. I've been doing this long enough to know when the play is run out." The study was very quiet. The estate was very quiet. Outside, the November dark had settled completely over the grounds, and the light in this room was the only light visible from any direction. "Did you love this family?" Adrian asked. "Not the empire. The people." Victor looked at him. "Did you love my father?" Adrian said. "Did you love Sophie? Did any of it, the 40 years of maintaining all this, did it mean something beyond the control?" Victor didn't answer immediately. He looked at his folded hands. I loved your father, he said finally. In my way. I believed I was protecting something he'd built. I believed that was what love looked like, maintaining what matters, removing what threatens it. He looked up. I understand that's not the answer you're looking for. I'm not looking for any particular answer, Adrian said. I just wanted to know. He picked up his phone from his jacket pocket and called the attorney. The attorney answered on the second ring and confirmed that the filing had been received and acknowledged, that the process was now in motion, and that the presence of the primary subject of the investigation would be required within the hour. Adrian ended the call. He looked at Victor. There's a process, he said. The attorneys arranged it so this doesn't happen in public. You'll be escorted by counsel, not police. It'll be quiet for as long as quiet is possible. He paused. That's not for you either. I want to be clear about that. Sophie, Victor said. Yes. Victor stood up from the chair. He straightened his shirt, rolled his sleeves back down, buttoned the cuffs with the unhurried, careful attention of a man who still believed the small dignities mattered even here. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and put it on. He looked around the study, at the cabinet, the desk, the bookshelves, the window that looked out onto the dark grounds. Your mother would be proud of you, he said. Adrian said nothing for a moment. The statement landed in a complicated place, given everything. She made a bad choice, he said finally. She was also my mother. I can hold both of those at once. He moved to the door. The attorney's car will be in the drive in 15 minutes. He left Victor in the study with the lamplight and the turned-down photographs and whatever a 61-year-old man does with the last 15 minutes of the life he spent 40 years building. He went out to the gravel drive and stood in the dark and cold and tipped his head back and looked at the sky, which was clear for the first time in days, the clouds having moved on to wherever clouds go when they're done. He stood there for a while. He drove back to the venue. The reception was winding down by the time he arrived. The dinner done, the dancing happening in that loose, tired way that late evening receptions develop when the formal structure has dissolved and people are staying more out of warmth than obligation. Sophie was on the dance floor with James, her shoes off, dancing with the specific freedom of a woman who has survived the day she was most nervous about and come out the other side in one piece. She saw Adrian come in. She looked at him across the room. He gave her a small nod. Just that. She closed her eyes for a moment, her cheek against James's shoulder, and when she opened them again, they were bright, and she kept dancing. He found Alara near the window at the far end of the hall. She was standing with Lila, who had Alara's jacket over her shoulders, and was eating something from a small plate and looking at the dancing with the objective, evaluating expression of a person deciding whether it was worth participating in. Lila looked up when he approached. She looked at him with the same direct, undeflected gaze she'd had in the corridor. The gaze of a child who has decided you're worth paying attention to, but hasn't decided yet exactly how much. It's over, he said to Alara. Not loudly, just to her. She looked at him. She read whatever was in his face. Victor, she said. He'll be with counsel by now. The process has started. It'll take time to work through fully, but the structural part, the part that was dangerous, that's done. She turned back to the window. She looked at the city lights beyond the glass. Her hands were loose at her sides, the first time he'd seen them fully loose since the shop 2 days ago, since before all of this. I've been in that building for 6 years, she said. The shop. I thought I'd built it. I thought it was mine. It will be, he said. When the Aldrin structure is dissolved, the lease converts to you. I'll make sure of it. He paused. The building itself, yeah, if you want to own it outright. I'll arrange the transfer, clean, no strings. She was quiet for a moment. I don't want anything from you, Adrian. I know. He stood beside her at the window. I'm not offering it as payment. I'm offering it because it should have been yours from the start. She looked at him sideways. The window reflected them both faintly against the dark outside. Two people standing near each other, not touching, with the particular charged stillness of people who are aware of the distance between them and the specific weight of what it would take to close it. Mom, Lila said, without looking away from the dancers, is he going to come to our house? Alara looked at her daughter. Not yet, Alara said, but maybe sometime. Lila processed this with the characteristic efficiency of a child who has asked a logistical question and received a logistical answer and is now moving on. She ate another bite from her plate. Okay, she said. Adrian looked at the side of Lila's face, the strong jaw, the focus, the way she moved through the world with the settled confidence of someone who's never doubted that she belonged in it, which was entirely Alara's doing. 7 years of building a child who didn't need to look around nervously to understand her own worth. He thought about what it meant that he'd missed that. Not abstractly. Specifically, the first word, the first steps, the first day she walked into a school building and probably didn't cry because she was not the kind of child who cried in public. The first time she argued someone down about something and won. The first time she got hurt and refused to show it because she'd already developed the specific armor that children develop when they're paying attention to the adults around them. He'd missed all of it. That was not Victor's fault alone. Some of it was Adrian's own. The years he'd spent choosing the Empire over the search, telling himself the search was done when it wasn't, building himself into the role he'd inherited rather than interrogating whether the role was worth building toward. He was going to have to live with that. The question was what he did from here. The reception ended at 9. Sophie found him near the coat check, alone, waiting for Alara and Lila to come back from the restroom. She hugged him without saying anything first, which was unusual for Sophie, who generally had words for everything. He held on. "Is it done?" she said into his shoulder. "The worst of it." She pulled back and looked at him. Her eyes were still bright from the dancing and from the day. And under the brightness was the specific exhaustion of a person who's been carrying knowledge for longer than they should have had to. "He was never going to stop," she said. "Victor, he would have kept going, you know that." "Yes." "So you did what you had to do." "I did what I had to do." He paused. It didn't feel like victory. "It's not supposed to," Sophie said, with the certainty of someone who's thought about this. Victory would have meant it was simple. It's not simple, but that doesn't mean it was wrong. She straightened the lapel of his jacket in the absent, proprietary way she'd done since she was 12 years old. "Now go find your people," she said. "I have a husband to go be married to." He watched her walk back across the emptying hall toward James, who was talking to someone near the bar, and looked up when Sophie appeared and did the specific thing his face did when she was nearby. A settling, a kind of completed quality, the expression of someone whose center of gravity has just returned. Adrian stood at the coat check alone for a moment. His people. It was an enormous phrase for something that was at this point one woman who didn't yet trust him and a 7-year-old who didn't yet know who he was. But Sophie had said it with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone describing a fact rather than a hope. And he found he wanted very badly to believe she was right. He drove Alara and Lila home. Lila fell asleep in the back seat before they'd cleared the venue parking lot, which happened with the absolute instantaneous quality of exhausted children. One moment awake and watchful, the next completely gone. Her head tilted against the window and her mouth slightly open and Alara's jacket still around her shoulders. Alara rode in the front passenger seat and looked out the window at the city going by. She didn't talk for the first 10 minutes. He didn't either. The car was warm and the streets were quiet, and the particular silence they had now was different from all the other silences. Not weighted with the past, not braced against the immediate future. Just present. "She's going to have questions," Alara said finally. "When she's rested, when she's had time to process last night." "I know." "She'll want answers, real ones. She's not a child who accepts partial information." Alara turned her head slightly, not quite looking at him. "I won't lie to her. I'm not asking you to. I'm telling you so you know what you're agreeing to. If you're going to be in her life, she's going to know exactly who you are and what your world is and what happened. All of it, when she's old enough to hold it." "That's fair." "It's not about fair." Her voice was quiet. "It's about her. Everything from here is about her." He looked at the road. "Agreed." She was quiet for another block. "You're going to be different to know," she said, "than who you've been. The world you're unwinding yourself from. That doesn't come clean easily. People who were in it, people who owed things to it, Those connections don't disappear because you filed some documents. No, they don't. So it's going to be complicated for a long time. Yes. And you're asking me to... She stopped, started again. You're not asking me anything yet. No, he said. I'm not. He turned onto her street. The Mercer Street neighborhood was quiet at this hour, the shop dark, the bucket of sunflowers gone inside for the night. I'm just driving you home. She looked at him then. He could feel it from the side, the specific weight of being looked at by someone who is deciding whether what they see matches what they've been told to expect. He pulled up outside her building and stopped the car. Neither of them moved for a moment. In the back seat, Lila made a small sound without waking, resettled, went still again. I don't know how to do this, Elara said, quietly, without the controlled flatness, just her voice, just the actual truth of the sentence. I spent 9 years building a life that didn't include you. I got good at it. I got good at not needing anything I couldn't build myself. She looked at her hands in her lap. And now you're here. And Lila looked at you in that corridor, and I could see her already. She stopped. Already what? She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. He knew what she'd seen. The specific gravity of a child organizing new information about herself. Slotting a person into a place she hadn't known was empty, with the quiet, ruthless adaptability of someone who doesn't yet have the defenses that would slow the process down. Lila had looked at him in the corridor and already begun deciding where he belonged. Children were faster at that than adults, less obstructed. I'm not asking for anything tonight, he said. I mean that. Tonight I'm asking you to take your daughter inside and sleep. That's all. Elara looked at him one more time. In the car's dim light, in the quiet of the street outside the shop she'd built from nothing, on a foundation she didn't know was watched, she looked at him with the unguarded expression of someone who is too tired to maintain the managed version of their face and has let the actual one come through. She looked, he thought, like herself. The way she'd looked at 24 before all of it, before the note that didn't exist in the 9 years in the shop and the raising of a child alone, worn down to the essential. Okay, she said. She got out of the car. She opened the back door and unbuckled Lila with the automatic careful touch of someone who's done it thousands of times. And Lila half woke and made a complaint without words and let herself be lifted out of the seat with the deadweight trust of a sleeping child who knows the hands holding her. Elara stood on the curb with her daughter against her shoulder. She looked at Adrian through the open door. Thank you, she said. For tonight. For... She made a small gesture that contained too many things to list. For coming back to that shop. He held her gaze. I spent 9 years not knowing what I was missing, he said. I'd rather not spend any more time that way. She nodded once. Then she turned and carried Lila toward the building entrance, and he watched them go. His daughter's face tucked into her mother's neck, small hand curled in Elara's collar, yellow rain jacket somewhere back at the venue, and probably lost forever. And he sat in the car until the building door closed behind them. Then he sat there a little longer. Dr. Hab. The weeks after that moved the way the aftermath of large events always moves. Not in dramatic beats, but in the small, grinding work of consequence. The investigative process was not quick and not simple. Victor's attorneys were good, and they delayed, and they constructed counterarguments that had to be systematically dismantled, and it took longer than Adrian had hoped and cost more than he'd estimated in every category. The Vail Company's public operations continued, the legitimate ones, the property holdings, the investments, the businesses that had been built over the last 3 years with deliberate distance from the older network, those survived. The older operations were wound down through a process that was not public and not clean, but was ultimately finished. Harmon honored his agreement, which Adrian suspected was partly genuine relief at the resolution of the setup that had been run against him, and partly the practical decision of a pragmatic man who understood which direction the situation had moved. Marcus stayed. He had stayed through worse, he said, and he said it with the brevity of someone who doesn't require recognition for loyalty and would probably be offended by a prolonged attempt to offer it. Sophie and James moved into a house on the north side of the city. She called Adrian twice a week. On one of those calls, about 6 weeks after the wedding, she mentioned carefully that she'd run into Elara at a market, and that Alara had been well, and that Lila had been with her and had informed Sophie at length about the correct way to choose a ripe pear. "She sounds like someone I know," Sophie said. "Imagine having to live with that," he said. Sophie laughed, bright and real. "I'm choosing to take that as optimism." He was quiet. "It is optimism," he said. The first time he went to the shop after everything was a Tuesday afternoon in late December, almost 7 weeks after the wedding. He didn't call first. He stood outside for a moment looking at the sign, Whitmore Floral, at the letters slightly uneven, hand-done, not trying to impress anyone, and then he pushed the door open and the bell made its thin, clean sound. Alara was at the work table. She looked up. She didn't tell him to leave. That was the beginning. He came back the following Tuesday, and the one after that. Sometimes Lila was there, and Lila interrogated him about things with the focused intensity of a child doing research. What kind of car did he drive? What did he eat for breakfast? Did he know how to do anything useful, like fix a bicycle or identify plants? And he answered all of it with the seriousness it deserved, because she was serious and she deserved to have that respected. The questions changed over time, got quieter, more specific. One afternoon in February, Lila was in the back room doing homework, and Alara was finishing a large arrangement near the window, and the shop was warm and smelled like eucalyptus and green stems. And Adrian was sitting on the stool near the counter, reading something on his phone, and he looked up and realized that no one in the room was performing anything. They were just there, occupying the same space. The way people do when they've spent enough time together that the self-consciousness has worn down to something more like ordinary life. He looked at Alara. She was concentrating on the arrangement, her hands moving the way they moved when she was focused. Automatic, precise, the hands of someone who's done something long enough that it's moved below thought. A piece of hair had come loose from where she'd pushed it back, and she kept ignoring it. She looked up and caught him looking. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "What?" she said. Not hostile, just curious. "Nothing," he said. "Just—" He stopped. She waited. "Just this," he said, meaning the shop, the afternoon, the sound of Lila in the back room, the warmth, the green smell. All of it. The ordinary specific weight of an ordinary Tuesday that felt, to him, like something enormous and fragile that he was holding very carefully with both hands. She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned back to the arrangement. "Yeah," she said quietly, "I know." He didn't push. He was learning, slowly and with considerable effort, what it meant to be patient without it being strategy, to want something and not immediately construct a plan to secure it, to let things arrive at their own speed and trust that the speed was right. He was not good at it yet. He was practicing. In March, Alara called him. Not about the shop or the lease or the legal situation, all of which had been handled through attorneys in the months prior. She called him at 7 in the evening on a Wednesday, and when he answered, she said without preamble, "Lila asked me today if she could call you." He sat very still in his kitchen with the phone. "She has your number," Alara said. "From when I put it in her emergency contacts after December. She hasn't used it. She wants to know if it would be okay." He put one hand flat on the kitchen table. He was aware of his own breathing. "Yes," he said. "It's okay. I told her I'd ask first. Thank you." A pause. Different from the other pauses. Not weighted, not braced, just the space between one thing and the next. "She's going to want to know," Alara said. "All of it. When she's a little older, she's already asking around the edges of it." "I know." "And you'll tell her, honestly, everything." "Everything," he said. "When it's right." Alara was quiet for a moment. "I'm not ready," she said, and he understood she was not talking about Lila. "I want to be honest with you about that. I'm not ready for whatever this becomes. I might not be ready for a while." "I know," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." She made the sound that was close to a laugh, but hadn't quite arrived there yet, the one he'd heard once before in this same conversation register. "You're very certain of yourself for a man who spent the last 4 months sitting on a stool in my shop reading his phone." "I learned things slowly," he said, "but I learned them." This time, the sound arrived. Brief, real, the laugh she'd had before all of it. Before the note that didn't exist, and the years and the grief, and the shop built on a foundation she didn't know was someone else's. He heard it and held it carefully with both hands. "Good night, Adrian," she said. "Good night." The line closed. He sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of his apartment, not the estate which he'd moved out of in January, a smaller place, a place that was his own rather than inherited, and he stayed very still for a while. His phone lit up 20 minutes later. An unknown number. He answered it. "Hi," said Lila. Her voice was matter-of-fact, the voice she used for all things, the voice that had probably been organizing the world around her since she was old enough to form a sentence. "It's Lila." "I know," he said. "Hi." "Mom said it was okay to call." "It is. I'm glad you did." A pause while she apparently organized her next sentence. "I have a question," she said. "Okay." "Do you know how to grow things? Like plants?" He blinked. "Not particularly. Why?" "I want to grow something from seeds, not flowers, vegetables. Mom said the shop isn't the right place for it because of the climate control, but I think she's wrong because I've been reading about it, and you can grow cherry tomatoes in containers, and they don't need that much light." A pause. "Do you have a window?" He looked across his apartment at the eastern window, large, south-facing actually, which was probably better. "Yes," he said, "I have a window." "Good," Lila said with the decisive tone of someone completing a logistics assessment. "Because I need a test location. Mom's windows face the wrong way." He sat in his kitchen in the quiet of a March evening, his daughter on the phone explaining the light requirements of cherry tomatoes with the focused intensity of a child who has decided you're useful and is now deploying you accordingly, and something in him that had been locked for 9 years and broken open and put back together in the wrong order and had spent the better part of a year finding the right configuration, something in that thing settled. Not finished. Not resolved in the clean way that stories resolve, where the cost disappears into the ending and what remains is only the light. He would carry the years. The photographs in Victor's cabinet, his mother's letters, the specific weight of 9 years of a daughter, growing up in a world he wasn't in. But he was in it now, and the window faced south. "Tell me what I need to buy," he said, and Lila told him.